Hi everyone. We are going to learn about controlling mapping result for null arguments and null properties. Sometimes we need to get a valid object even though we are passing either null argument or null property. Mapstruct provides the flexibility to control the null arguments and the null properties through annotation. This annotation and its properties can be used at either at the mapper or at the mapping annotation. If we provide the null check strategies at mapper annotation, then it will be applicable for all the methods inside the mapper. And if we provide the null check strategy at the mapping annotation, it would be applicable for that property alone and for that method alone. Now we are going to look into these null check properties or null check strategies one after another, and we are going to validate the mapper implementation for both create and update methods. So let's check the current implementation. As part of the current implementation, we have the %db object which has ID, first name, last name, date of birth and salary, and the DTO has first name, last name, date of birth, salary and age. And if we check the implementation for the age, we are using the date of birth and we are calculating the map age. The implementation is provided at the age operations class. Age operations class, we have used named annotation to map the method to a property. So in our case, it's been mapped using the qualified by name and which will be linked to the named annotation. So let's check the implementation for the 2DTO. At the 2DTO, if the source is null, then it is returning null, and if source is not null, it's creating an object and it is trying to set all the values as per our mappings and return the %DTO object. And if we check the update DTO, it's the same. If the source is null, then it is simply returning it. It's no updates on DTO. And if the source properties are not null, and it is setting it up for the date of birth and the salary and remaining calculating the age, first name, last name and returning back. In the assertions, I already added the minimum assertions for the null check, null value mapping strategy and null check strategy, and even for the null value property strategy. And we will implement one after another and we'll look at the implementations as well. Okay, let's check the null value mapping strategy. So let's comment over the other assertions for now. Let's run it. Now the null value mapping strategy has not applied. So this session would fail because it will be setting it to the null itself. So let's run the test case and see it. So if we see it, it's failed at the assertion not null. Let's implement the null value mapping strategy. Let's add the null value mapping strategy at the mapper annotation level. Null mapping strategy expects one of these values. One is return default or return null. So by default, it's been set to return null. So let's check the mapper class and look for the null value mapping strategy. And it's been set to return null. So that is the reason the implementations as returning null. So if I add as default, so what happens? Let's check the implementation. Now the null check is not being performed while creating the DTO object. So first it created the object and it is checking for the source is not null or not for setting the DTO properties. Otherwise it's returning the direct DTO object which is empty. And what about the update? Even the update also exactly the same because the update already we have DTO, that's why it is not created. And for the source object, it's been checked for the null. If not null, then only it set the properties on the target mapping object. So let's run the test case now. Now it has been success because now the mapper DTO, if it is null, it's not setting any of the properties, but the DTO object has been created and it's been returned. Now let's check the null value check strategy. Let's uncomment this session. So what exactly this null value check strategy? So null value check strategy is checking for the property, source property value before it sets on the target property. What I mean is here in case of the age, date of birth is the source property and it's calling the map page. So in the map page, I have not implemented any of the checks. In this case, I have written this constant value. This is for testing purpose. But if I need to calculate the real age, so at that time I need to use the date of birth, which is passed as an input argument. And if it is null, I need to handle it. Otherwise, we would get the runtime exception. So if we check this one, wherever this age is being called, it's directly calling it without checking the date of birth. So I would like to add a check before I set a value on the target. So for that, we need to use the null value check strategy. So let's add that property. And it has two options. One is unimplicit conversion, another one is always. So let's go and check at the mapper class to find out the default value. Default value is unimplicit. Only the map construct adds the checks while performing the data type conversion. So now I'm saying that add it to always means each and every property will be checked for the null and then calling the setters on the target mapping object. So let's check the implementation. In the implementation, each and every property of the source has been checked for the null. If not null, then only the set method on target object has been called. And what about the update? It's the same for the update. The source check has been run for each and every property and sets the default value. In this case, it's a null. Now let's run the test case and here get age. Now the date of birth has not been set, so it is a null. So date of birth is null, so the set age will not be called. And this DTO object, age is a primitive data type, so it will be assigned to the default value. In this case, it would be 0. So let's run the test case and check. And it has been success. Now let's look at the null value property mapping strategy, and this will be applicable only to the update mapper, not to the create one. Why is it? If we see the implementation, here in case of the create, there are no else blocks for the null checks. But in case of the update, we have the else blocks for each null check. So let's uncomment this. So what we are doing here, we have the last name and it's been null at the first time. So the D2 has been created and the D2's last name is null. After that, we are updating the last name and then calling the update D2. And this time we are expecting last name is not null. I have modified the assertion logic. So this time we are using a different object, which is a source2, and it has only the last name. It doesn't have the first name or the ID, any other properties. It has only one, and I'm expecting the last name to be updated, not the first name. So here the first name is not null. Let's add that assertion as well at the first. Now when I run the test case, it has failed at here because the first name becoming null. The reason for it is in the update method, if the first name is not null, then only it is setting it. In our case, the first name is null because source2 doesn't have the first name. It has only the last name. So it's setting it to the null. How can I control this one? Why it is been setting to null? That is because of the third property, which is null value property mapping strategy. Let's implement this one. It has total 3 options. One, ignore, another one is set to default, and the third one is set to null, which is a default. Let's check the mapper class. If we see it set to null, what it means is if the property is null, then it sets to null. If the source property, in this case, if the first name source property is null, then it is setting to the null by force. And what about if I change it to set it to default? So it will be set to the default values. In case of the string, it would be empty. In case of any of the integers or the numbers, then it will be set to the default value. Let's check the implementation for the update method because there are no changes for the create method. If we see it each and every place, if the property source property is null, then they are resetting it to empty, and here also empty. And in this case, first name it's been set to the empty, which is a default value. In case of the string, empty string is the default value. In case of the integer, it is a default value is 0. So let's run the test case. Now it is success because it is not null. but actually it's been reset to empty string. So let's cross check that one also. Asset equals, what I'm expecting is the same name, which is from, in this case, dto dot get first name. Now it would fail because if the first name is null, then it's been reset to the default value. So if we check it, it had failed at this session because it's been changed. So let's check the value. It is trying to check the RAM value with empty because it's resetting to empty string. So let's change the strategy to ignore it. So in case of null value has been passed, then it will not process the check. If the null value is being set at the property, then the target mapping will not be called. So if we see it, only if it is not null, then only it's being called. So let's run the test case, and this time it will be successful because first name has not been touched. As it is null for the source 2, it's not calling the %dto.set first name. So we have learned how to control mapping result for null argument and null properties for create and update mappings. And that's all for now. Thank you.